European leaders are in Paris today for a meeting of the Coalition of the Willing to discuss continued support for Ukraine. The coalition, jointly led by France and the UK, now includes 37 nations. Moldova and North Macedonia are taking part for the first time. President Volodymyr Zelensky is expected to be there today too. Well, Arisia Lutsevich is head of the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House and joins us now. Good morning.
Good morning.
What are you hoping to see from this meeting today?
Well, as always with these meetings, the most important thing is to demonstrate that Europe is not tired of keeping Ukraine in this very important mission for its own security, is to defend against Russian illegal invasion. And this is exactly the message it sends. As we see, we are trying different formats outside of NATO, outside of EU, that would allow more agility, easier decision making, and also more ad hoc coalitions that would, for example, like in the case of the Coalition of the Willing, focus on important things such as air defense.
Why is there that need? Sorry, Arisia, why is there a need for these structures outside NATO or European Union structures, for example? I mean, there were 37 different nations in this Coalition of the Willing, so it can't be that nimble. What's the difference?
I think partially is decision making. If you look at the NATO, on one hand, it's heavily dominated by the United States, as we know, for capabilities and in general in the culture of this organization. And as we know, Trump is not a big supporter of Ukraine, wants to stay away from Europe, so that is very difficult to use NATO for all the necessary needs. So European Union in a similar way, it's unanimous decision making. It's difficult to get countries like in the past Hungary or now difficulties with Poland. So we need formats where really those who are willing, as it says in the title, to do more for security and defense of Europe, perhaps to put it more correctly, to compensate the deficits of these other organizations.
And when we talk about doing more, what specifically do you mean? What is it that, because we know Ukraine, for example, needs air defense systems, and there's been the agreement with the Americans to give Ukraine the license to build some of that capability themselves. But what do you want from this coalition of countries? What more is it that's needed now?
So there are two specific issues that are discussed. One, very urgent indeed, that this is the joint air defense. And it's not only for Ukraine. What Ukraine is offering is the use of its technology and the testing ground against Russian missiles as they daily barrage Ukrainian cities and critical infrastructure to develop tools. In addition to Patriots, as we know, they're in short supply. So there's an offer from Ukraine to do another ballistic missile system, which may take time, but it's an interesting offer. Another one is how do we ramp up indeed production of Patriots, having that license? Will this be a joint project where the factory will be located? Who will be co-producing it? So all of this will be discussed, and this is more critical, especially ahead of winter, where we do know Russia steps up attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure and already has destroyed 50% of electricity generation.
Just finally, I know you are expert in Ukraine. There is obviously a change in the political system there. Volodymyr Zelensky has changed the prime minister in Ukraine. What's the thinking behind that? What's the plan?
Yeah, it's interesting. The Yulia Sviridenko, who served as the prime minister for 1 year, is been now dismissed. And we do not have exactly the likely future prime minister, because that is within the powers of the president to nominate the candidates that will be voted in the parliament. But I think the logic is there is a war of attrition, and he needs somebody who is able to stabilize the home front, to stabilize the economy. One possible candidate is the CEO of Ukrainian gas company, very successful manager, who could exactly stabilize the defense of energy infrastructure, but also generate extra capacity and also build these battery storages that are so much necessary. So I think that's mainly led by the need to strengthen energy system resilience and to focus really all cabinet efforts around that.
Arisia Lutsevich, thank you very much for joining us on the programme this morning.
Thank you.
She is the head of Ukraine Forum at Chatham House.
We were talking about accountability this morning. I mean, there's going to become a point when Zelensky will have been in power. If this war goes on for another 4 or 5 years, they can't have elections by their own rules because of being in a state of war. But he will have effectively become, and people use this term, it's not fair to say he's a dictator, but he effectively becomes someone who's not democratically sustained for very good reasons. But at what point does that become an issue? Ukraine has problems with corruption. You can have an administration in place for years and years and years and years. At some point, that's going to have to resolve itself in one direction. Because it's not implausible this war could go on for another half decade.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, that. And obviously the logic is that you can't have a general election, you can't have an election there because not all citizens would be able to vote because they're not all in Ukraine and it's a war and they don't have elections during a war. But I suspect, there is this tussle, isn't there? Because Russia wants rid of Zelensky. And we've heard from the American side before that maybe, they also wouldn't mind getting rid of Zelensky, although I think relations have improved over recent months between those two sides. It's an interesting question about accountability. I think people will have a close eye on who is the next Prime Minister and on what this political strategy is.
Because it's very understandable, but you still need democracy to assert itself at some point in the process, you'd have thought. Yeah,
and also people in Ukraine are becoming frustrated. Life is very difficult there. The lack of this air defence system is making life increasingly difficult, and I think we ought to say very clearly that Russia is now targeting not military targets, not frontline targets, but civilian areas, civilian infrastructure, apartment buildings in the heart of cities, and that changes the way that people feel and the ability of to be resilient. And we are coming towards winter. People will have their minds turning towards winter and how very difficult it was last year for those in Ukraine.
Emmanuel Macron has told French troops that Europe is ready to defend its freedom with blood if necessary. The statement from the French president comes on the eve of Bastille Day and as world leaders gather in Paris for meetings on Ukraine. Keir Starmer is amongst those attending the Coalition of the Willing summit. He's reportedly set to sign the UK up to the EU €60 billion fund to support Ukraine's defence. Let's talk to Anne Applebaum, who is a journalist and author. Anne, a very good afternoon. Do you believe now that Europe really is ready to shed blood for peace?
So far, Europe's not being asked to shed blood for peace. It's being asked to pay for the war. And so far, it's working. Europe, a year ago, people said things like, without the US, we can't do it. Europe is too weak. It's too divided. Europe, meaning not just the EU, but Europe plus the UK plus others. And it turned out that was not the case. That Europe is not only willing to lend weapons, various European countries and European companies have been investing directly in Ukraine, co-building drones with Ukraine, using Ukraine's new technology to improve their own. So we see something rather different emerging.
What does a €60 billion fund buy?
It buys the most advanced military technology in the world. It pays for Ukraine's drone industry, which, as I said, is eventually going to morph into being European drone industry and European defense tech companies. It pays for the Ukrainians to keep fighting. And of course, as long as the Ukrainians are fighting and as long as they're holding the line, which they've done for the last several months, then Europe is not directly in danger. So it is a way of Europe defending itself.
It is sometimes hard for us civilians, Anne, to understand some of the figures involved in military and defence spending. I mean, is €60 billion enough? I mean, is there any idea how long that might last? Is it actually dwarfed by comparison to what the US could spend if it wanted to? Where does it lie?
I mean, it's not the only source of funding. The EU has funding for Ukraine, and some individual countries do as well. I'm afraid off the top of my head, I don't know the total numbers, but I know that what's on the table now, everybody feels pretty confident that it's enough to cover the next couple of years in terms of military production, defense, in terms of, as I said, keeping the army on the ground.
Sure. And Anne, you used a very key word there that, everybody does. This is the Coalition of the Willing Summit. But talk us through levels of commitment, levels of enthusiasm here, because they won't all be exactly the same.
They aren't all exactly the same. I mean, there is something clear inside Europe, which is a group of countries who are particularly focused on this war, and they understand it is a direct threat to them and to the integrity of their borders and the safety of their civilians. And that's the Baltic states, Scandinavia, Poland, Germany, and maybe to a slightly lesser extent the UK, although the UK plays a very important role in motivating and persuading others, and is part of some of the defense structures of that group. So, and their interests are understandably a little bit different from those of Spain. And Spain doesn't feel the direct threat from Russia, although, of course, Spain, like everyone else in Europe, has been subject to Russian sabotage. There have been some murders inside Spain conducted by Russian operatives. Spain has been part of, Russian influence campaigns are run in Spain just like they're run everywhere else. But they don't feel this direct military threat, so they're contributing a little bit less. I don't think anybody is angry about any of that. I mean, it's there. I don't think there's a magic number that everybody needs to meet. The country right now that's doing the most in terms of real rearmament is Germany. I mean, in terms of sheer numbers of military spending, they've really made a big alteration to the way they fund the military. They've agreed to borrow money for it. They are putting effort into it in a way that they haven't done since the end of the Cold War, if not before. And in terms of the percentage of GDP numbers, then the highest contributors are the Baltic states and Poland. Poland is up at 4% or 5%, depending on which exact numbers you use.
Right.
And that in the case of those countries, that reflects this very long-term, going back several years, big investments in new platforms and so on.
Is it a bit strange for Sir Keir Starmer, right at the end of his tenure, to be present? How is he dealing with that?
I think it's great that Keir Starmer is going. He's seen inside Europe as a supporter of Ukraine. Ukraine's appreciated his trips there and the gestures that he made. He's still the British Prime Minister. He represents the interests of the UK, and I hope a pretty bipartisan interest. I mean, it's also in Britain's interest that Russia not win this war, because a Russia that wins the war in Ukraine would be that much more aggressive, that much wealthier, and that much more able eventually to strike even the UK or to involve itself again in UK politics, as it's done in the past. So I think it's absolutely appropriate for him to come, and I'm sure people will be glad to see him there.
And do you think that Andy Burnham automatically gets a warm welcome continuity handshake?
Probably. I mean, I don't know that his politics or his exact views are well known. But there will be expectations that the UK, as a member of the Coalition of the Willing, as a country that works closely with other European countries in self-defense, will be a partner, and I'm sure he'll be welcome.
And do you think that Keir Starmer might have a personal future in Europe, or more specifically at NATO?
That I cannot tell you. I don't know a crystal ball. I don't know. These are very weird selection processes involving all kinds of elements, and it's the NATO role in particular is very influenced by the US, and so it'll depend on who is then the US president at the time the next person is chosen, and so on. So I don't have a way of predicting
that.
Yeah,
and that could be head-spinningly different from one day to the next. And in
exactly.
fact, Anne, I mean, on that front, tell us your thoughts about where Donald Trump is at the moment with the tune that he's playing in the direction of Ukraine. I mean, it is quite hard to keep up with the man, isn't it?
So he is as volatile on Ukraine as he is on everything else. And so it's very hard to follow a clear strategy or line of thought. He has recently been, appeared in public to, on a couple of occasions to be more friendly towards Ukraine. He made a gesture at the last NATO summit of saying that Ukraine would be allowed to produce air defense missiles. This is the main thing. This is actually going to be the main subject of the Coalition of the Willing meeting. The main thing that Ukraine lacks, and that all of us lack actually, is air defense that can knock out especially ballistic missiles and also cruise missiles. And Trump said that Zelensky would be allowed to produce them. That's somewhat less relevant or less exciting than it sounds, because starting up any such production line is a really big long-term project and could take many years, and the need for air defense is like next week, and so it doesn't solve the immediate problem. But he's made these gestures. It seems that he says sometimes that he's been disappointed in Putin. I mean, I don't know, he had a very unrealistic vision of what the Russian president was going to do. He had some idea that he was going to, within 24 hours they would solve the war because they were such good friends. And I think maybe he's disappointed that assumption turned out to be wrong. I think everybody's impressed with the degree to which the Ukrainians are now able to hit deep into Russia, to hit Russian oil refineries, and the way they've been able to hold the line over the last few months, despite this constant Russian offensive. And I don't know, maybe even Donald Trump is impressed by that, or sometimes he sounds like he is. I would say that.
Yep. I mean, what we've seen in the past happen is that if there is a diplomatic advance for the Ukrainians, it is met by very heavy military pressure from Russia. Would you expect that to be the outcome after this Coalition of the Willing summit? Because the Ukrainians have undoubtedly been bolstered by this support, so Russia just pounds on them again to prove that it can?
I mean, I'm not sure this will change that. I mean, this is just simply what they do. Every so often they attack Kiev with dozens of drones and dozens of missiles. And I'm not sure it even is connected to any one event or another. Sometimes maybe they do it symbolically. Sometimes they just do it periodically. Some of this is their frustration. Look, the front line has not, or barely moved in the last few months. The Russians are suffering gasoline shortages all across the country because of the Ukrainian drone campaign. Their stronghold in Crimea, which is symbolically very important to Putin. It was a peninsula, remember, that he captured in 2014 in a surprise attack from Ukraine. It is now very close to being cut off. The tourist season has ended. People are going home. People are leaving. There are shortages of everything: electricity, water, and these are really concrete successes that everyone can see. And so if Putin is angry about anything, it would be that. And one of the few things that he still has that he can in his arsenal is he can still attack civilians. So he can still use missiles on Ukrainian cities that the Ukrainians have trouble defending against. That's literally the last weapon he has that isn't able to be met. And that will be the main subject of this meeting in Paris. It will be, how do we provide Ukraine with more air defense? How do we begin to plan to have more air defense in the future?
Anne, it's always good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for your time this afternoon. Journalist and author Anne Applebaum.